Facebook now. Good evening. My name is John Kay with Socialist Resurgence. Tonight we're offering a discussion of the three major strikes of 1934, the Toledo Autolite strike, the Minneapolis Teamster strike, and the San Francisco Longshore strike, and their implications. I would like to introduce Dean Cohen, a former Vice President of the United Auto Workers Local 217, and a member of Socialist Resurgence. Dean, take it away.
Thank you, John. And I'd like to start off by thanking everybody for inviting us into your homes and lives this evening for a little bit via your computer screens and smartphones. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to great lengths tonight to not seem like I'm lecturing here. Instead, what I'm going to strive to do, so I'm not really not a lecturer or a professor or a historian, but what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to provide you with some information of a historical nature, along with some observations, which I hope will generate some good discussion following this little presentation. So we can get started. Oh, almost forgot. Before I get started, I'm going to try and give you three terms and to put forth a little bit of a brief definitions of these three terms that we're probably going to come up with, well, we are going to come up with in this discussion. The first term, or the three terms, are class struggle, class consciousness, and trade union consciousness. Now, first term, class struggle, just briefly, in Marxist theory, the world is divided into two main opposing classes under the capitalist system. We have the working class, sometimes classically referred to as the proletariat, and that's those of us who work for a living, we whose labor produce all wealth. And you have the capitalist class, the ruling class, the boss class, sometimes classically referred to as the bourgeoisie. This is the class that owns all the wealth produced by the labor of the working class through the capitalist ownership of the means of production, which is the factories, mines, mills, hospitals, state apparatus, etc. These two classes, Marx said, are in constant, unremitting conflict with each other due to their opposing interests having to do with the ever-declining rate of profit which capitalism experiences, and the capitalists' constant attempts to make up this decline in profit by attacking the living standards of the workers, attacks which the working class attempts to fight back against. The struggle goes on around as long as the capitalist system exists. Class struggle goes on around us every day, and it is therefore like evolution or any other science for that matter. It exists whether or not anybody believes in it. Class consciousness. And we can start off by saying that the capitalists are very conscious of themselves as a class. Although sections of the capitalists in capitalist nations may find themselves in competition with each other, and sometimes that competition can get ugly. I mean, like, World War II ugly. At the end of the day, the capitalists realize that they are all members of the same class, and they need to unite against the working class in order to maintain their dominance. The problem comes in is that the workers, for the most part, especially here in the United States, are not conscious of themselves as a class. And this makes it difficult for the working class to overcome differences among ourselves in terms of race, gender, age, etc., and unite against the ruling class. And as we all know, the ruling class is exceptionally good at exploiting these differences. Trade union consciousness. This is a concept of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, whose 150th birthday we just celebrated, introduced in a 1909 work entitled What is to be Done? Lenin wrote essentially that most workers find it difficult to move beyond the fight for higher wages and more benefits. He referred to this as the workers' trade union consciousness. Lenin also referred to this as economism. It takes revolutionary socialists with a firm grasp of Marxism and the concept of class consciousness and the class struggle to help the working class overcome this economism. This doesn't mean socialists stand apart from the workers and lecture, but real revolutionary socialists organized in vanguard party who take part in the class struggle. Now, let's get started. We're going to talk today about some events that led up to the foundation of what is, in my humble opinion, unarguably the most important organization in the history of the American working class, some would say in the history of the United States. the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. Many of you know the CIO by its present hyphenated name of the AFL-CIO since 1955, that is. But how many of you know its early militant history and importance? Its birth in 1935 amidst the trials and tribulations of the Great Depression. The CIO and the industrial union movement that created it was nothing short of a semi-revolutionary upsurge of the American working class. In a brief period of only 2 years, 1935 to 1937, it was one of the most dynamic forces the world working class had seen, organizing some 4 million new workers by the time of its founding convention in 1938, many of them black workers who had never been allowed to join a union before. And it signed contracts with two of the biggest corporations in the world, General Motors and United States Steel. 1937 also saw the CIO's first big defeat at the hands of the Little Steel Combine. Little Steel being anything that wasn't United States Steel or Big Steel, namely Republic Steel, Inland Steel, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, etc. Which, Little Steel, along with the Ford Motor Company, would remain open shop for another 4 years. Other attempts at organizing American workers along industrial lines in the past had come up short. But to quote George Novak in his excellent work on Even and Combined Development in History, and I quote, "After decades of the most discouraging and demoralizing delay, the American workers obtained their industrial organization in one mighty leap during the 1930s through the CIO. They compressed several stages of development in this leap. For instance, the American auto workers did not proceed through craft unionism to industrial unionism, but went at one bound from a state of non-organization to the highest form of industrial organization, skipping the intervening craft stage. Now, prior to the rise of the industrial union movement, most workers in the US were organized into craft unions, affiliated with the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. Craft unionism can be defined as dividing workers into unions based on their skill or craft rather than on the industry in which they work. Workers in craft unions, therefore, begin to think more in terms of their craft interests rather than their class interests. The AFL was dominated by the craft unions, such as those in the building trades, plumbers, bricklayers, carpenters, electricians, etc. There were some AFL affiliates who were organized along industrial lines, like the garment workers, mine workers, and brewery. But for the most part, it was dominated by the craft unions. The CIO was to challenge and change all that. The CIO's success was made possible by the economic and social factors which would drive world capitalism to the brink of collapse after 1929. From October 1929, when the unemployment rate stood at 3.2% nationally, unemployment rose in 1933 to 25% nationally. And that didn't tell half the story. In industrial areas like Detroit, had an unemployment rate of 50%. Toledo's unemployment rate stood at 80%. I can't even imagine. But 1932 had seen the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promised a New Deal, quote unquote, for the American people. After the passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act, also known as the NRA, in June of 1933, with its much praised and ballyhooed Section 7A, which supposedly gave, quote unquote, labor the right to organize and strike, which in fact it already had, a wave of militancy swept through the labor movement, fed by the call of President Roosevelt wants you to join a union. 1933 saw the biggest strike wave since 1919. In 1932, the total number of workers on strike stood at 324,000. The very next year, 1933, saw that number rise to 1,168,000. That included 35,000 amalgamated clothing workers, 60,000 dressmakers of the International Ladies Garment Workers, 50,000 Paterson, New Jersey silk workers, more than a dozen strikes in auto, and many more in mining. All these strikes were heroically and militantly waged on the part of the workers. All were viciously attacked by Roosevelt as communist-inspired, and most failed. Why? We'll see if we can look into that. In 1934, things would change. In the first place, a slight upturn took place in the economy toward the latter part of 1933. Workers began to return to the factories. Upsurges usually don't take place during times of deep recession. The uptick in the economy gave workers a little bit of breathing room. The shock and despair of the last 3 years began to give way to a renewed militancy. In 1934, 3 strikes would pave the way for the formation of the CIO: the Toledo Autolite strike, the San Francisco waterfront strike, and the Minneapolis Teamsters strike. Now, at this point, I'd like to say that I don't intend to get into a minute-by-minute, day-by-day account of each and every strike. That would take us far too long, and besides, there are some extremely good books available on those strikes, such as Teamster Rebellion by Farrell Dobbs, that you should check out. And at the end of this presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some books that talk about these strikes. If you haven't gotten them, if you haven't yet started putting together your own print library on labor history, these are some good books to focus on. But right now, I'd like to focus on what these strikes had in common that allowed them to succeed where others had failed. I believe that the most important thing these 3 strikes had in common was class struggle leadership. Now, we already talked about class struggle. So what's a class struggle leadership? When I was trying to prepare this talk, I suddenly found myself at a complete block when I was trying to come up with a definition of exactly what a class struggle leadership was. So what I did was I turned to the internet and I put out a call for help. And a Facebook friend of mine and some of yours, Arthur M., a longtime revolutionary socialist and former leader of the SWP, came to my aid. And I want to give Arthur a shout out when I used this quote because I thought it was quite good. Arthur said, and I quote, "A class struggle leadership means, in practice, a leadership which knows that there are opposed interests at stake in any strike. A leadership which knows that there are that the state is not a neutral entity in this question. It means, in practice, a leadership which realizes that workers should appeal to other workers for support, and that solidarity is basic to all union activity. It means that the leadership understands that the union ranks have to be mobilized on an ongoing basis and not demobilized between strikes. The leadership must therefore be aware that the workers will have to defend themselves against not only the company, but against the entire state apparatus." For example, the Minneapolis Teamsters strike consisted of 3 strikes. The first strike was for union recognition and an initial contract. The 2 strikes which followed were forced upon the union by the bosses and were necessary to defend and extend the gains won by the first strike. Had the local leadership demobilized the membership after the first strike and had not prepared the membership for the long haul, the gains won by the first strike